Agnes D. Kingston. Chapter 12. Threefold Light. Hindustan shares with certain places of Brazil, among others with Rio Janeiro, the proud distinction of being more frequently visited by storms than any other country on the face of the globe. In France, England, Germany, and all the central parts of Europe, the average number of days on which thunder is heard is 20 per annum, while in the East Indies the average during the same time is more than 50. That is the ordinary meteorological calculation. On this particular occasion we had every reason, on account of various attendant circumstances, to expect a storm of extreme violence. I consulted the barometer as soon as we re-entered our apartments, and found that there had been a sudden fall of 2 inches in the mercurial column. This I pointed out to Colonel Munro. "I am uneasy about Hood and his companions," he said. "A storm is imminent. Night is coming on, and the darkness rapidly increases. Sportsmen are certain always to go farther than they say they will, and even than they intend. How are they to find their way back to us?" "Madman that he is!" cried Banks. "It was impossible to make him listen to reason. They never ought to have gone." "That is true enough, Banks, but gone they are," replied Sir Edward. "All we can do now is to try and get them back." "Can we signal to them, anyhow?" I asked. "To be sure we can. I will light the electric lamps at once. That is a happy thought of yours, Mockler." "Shall I go in search of Captain Hood, sir?" inquired McNeill. "No, my old friend," replied the Colonel. "You would not find him, and would be lost yourself." Banks connected the electric current, and very soon Behemoth's eyes, like 2 blazing beacons, shot glaring light athwart the gloom of the banyan forest. It seemed certain that it would be visible to our sportsmen at a considerable distance. At this moment a hurricane of great violence burst forth, rending the tree-tops and sounding among the columns of banyan as though rushing through sonorous organ-pipes. It was indeed a sudden outburst. Showers of leaves and dead branches strewed the ground, and rattled upon the roofs of our carriages. We closed every window, but the rain did not yet fall. "This is a specimen of typhoon," remarked Banks. The Hindus give this name to the sudden and impetuous tempests which devastate more especially the mountainous districts, and are much dreaded by the natives. "Store," cried Banks to the engine-driver, "are the embrasures of the turret well closed?" "Yes, Mr. Banks, there is nothing to fear there." "Where is Carluth?" "He is stowing away the last of the fuel in the tender." "After this storm we shall only have to collect the wood. The wind is playing woodcutter and sparing us all the hard work," said the engineer. "Keep up the pressure, Starr, and get under shelter." "Aye, aye, sir." "Are your tanks filled, Carluth?" "Yes, Sahib, the water supply is made up." "Well, come in, come in." And the engine-driver and stoker hastened into the second carriage. Flashes of lightning were now frequent, and thunder from the electric clouds kept up a sullen roar. The wind blew like scorching blasts from the mouth of a furnace. Occasionally we left the saloon and went into the veranda. Gazing upward at the lofty summits of the stately banyans, the branches showed like fine black lace against the glowing background of the illumined sky. The incessant lightning was followed so rapidly by the peals of thunder that the echoes had not time to die away. They were continually aroused by new and yet louder explosions. A deep continuous roll was maintained, and only broken by those sharp detonations so well compared by Lucretius to the harsh screaming sound of paper when it is torn. "I wonder the storm has not yet driven them in," said Colonel Munro. "Perhaps Captain Wood has found some shelter in the forest," answered Sergeant McNeill. "He may be waiting in some cave or hollow tree, and will rejoin us in the morning. The camp will be here all right." Banks shook his head somewhat doubtfully. He did not seem to share McNeill's opinion. It was now about 9 o'clock, and the rain began to fall with great force. It was mingled with enormous hailstones, and they pelted on the hollow roofs of Steam-house with a noise like the roll of many drums. Even without the roar of the thunder, it was impossible to hear our own voices. The air was full of the leaves of trees, whirling in all directions. Banks did not attempt to speak, but pointed to the engine, directing our attention to the hailstones as they struck the metal sides of Behemoth. It was marvelous. Each stone struck fire in the contact, like flint and steel. It seemed as though showers of fiery metallic drops fell from the clouds, sending forth sparks as they struck the steel-plated engine. This proved how completely the atmosphere was saturated with electricity. Fulminating matter traversed it incessantly, till all space seemed to blaze with fire. Banks signed to us to return to the saloon, and closed the veranda door. The darkness within the room contrasted strongly with the lightning which flashed without. We had presently a proof that we were ourselves strongly charged with the electric fluid, when, to our infinite astonishment, we perceived our saliva to be luminous. This phenomenon, rarely observed, and very alarming when it is so, has been described as spitting fire. The tumult of the heavens seemed every instant to increase, and the stoutest hearts beat thick and fast. "And the others," said Colonel Munro. "Oh, yes, indeed, the others," returned Banks. We were horribly uneasy, yet could do nothing whatever to assist Captain Hood and his companions, who were, of course, in the utmost danger. Even supposing they had found shelter, it could only be beneath trees, where accidents during storms are most imminent, and in the middle of a dense forest. How could they possibly maintain the distance of 5 or 6 yards from a vertical line drawn from the extremity of the longest branches, which persons caught by storms in the neighborhood of trees are scientifically advised to do? As these thoughts rushed through my mind, a peal of thunder, louder than any we had heard, burst directly over us. Steam-house trembled throughout, and seemed to rise on its springs. I expected it to be overturned. At the same time a strong odour filled the room, the penetrating smell of nitrous vapours. "A thunderbolt has fallen," said McNeil. "Storr, Carluth, Parasard," shouted Banks. The 3 men came running into our apartment, while the engineer stepped out on the balcony. "There! Look there!" he cried. An enormous banyan had been struck 10 paces off, on the left of the road. We could see everything distinctly by the glare of incessant lightning. The immense trunk had fallen across the neighbouring trees, its sturdy saplings no longer able to sustain it. The whole length of its bark had been peeled off, and one long strip was waving about and lashing the air, as the force of the gale made it twist and twine like a serpent. It was seen that the bark must have been stripped off from base to summit, under the influence of electricity, which had violently rushed upwards. "A narrow escape for Steam-house," said the engineer. "We must remain here. We are safer than under those trees." As he spoke we heard cries. Could it be our friends returning? "It is Parasard's voice," said Storr. It was indeed the cook who, from the hinder balcony, was loudly calling to us. We hastened to join him. What a sight met our eyes! Within 100 yards of us, behind and to the right of the camp, the banyan forest was on fire. Already the loftier tree-tops were disappearing behind a curtain of flame. The conflagration advanced fiercely and with incredible velocity towards Steam-house. The danger was imminent. The heat and long continuous drought had combined to make trees, grass, and bushes so dry and combustible that it was probable the entire forest would be devoured by the furious element. As we witnessed its rapid spread and advance, we were convinced that should it reach the place of our encampment, our entire equipage would, in a very few minutes, be destroyed. We stood silent before this fearful danger. Then, folding his arms, the colonel said quietly, "Banks, you must get us out of this scrape." "Yes, I must, Munro," replied the engineer, "and since we cannot possibly put out this fire, we must run away from it." "On foot?" exclaimed I. "No, with our train all complete." "And Captain Hood, sir?" said McNeil. "We can do nothing for them. If they are not here immediately, we shall start without them." "We must not abandon them," said the colonel. "My dear Munro, let me get the train out of reach of the fire, and then we can search for them." "Go on then, Banks," replied Colonel Munro, who saw that the engineer was in the right. "Store," cried Banks, "to your engine at once. Carluth, to your furnace, get the steam up. What pressure have we?" 2 atmospheres, answered the engine driver. "Within 10 minutes we must have 4. Look sharp, my lads." The men did not lose a moment. Torrents of black smoke gushed from the Elephant's trunk, meeting and seeming to defy the torrents of rain. Behemoth replied with whirling clouds of sparks to the vivid flashes which surrounded him, and draughts of air whistling through the funnel accelerated the combustion of the wood which Carluth heaped and piled on his furnace. Sir Edward Munro, Banks, and I remained on the veranda in rear of the carriages, watching the progress of the forest fire. Huge trees tottered and fell across this vast hearth, and branches cracked and crackled like musketry. The burning creepers twisted in all directions and led the flames from tree to tree, thus spreading the devastation right and left. Within 5 minutes the conflagration had advanced 50 yards, and the flames, torn and dishevelled by the gale, shot upward to such a height that the lightning flashes pierced them in all directions. "We must be off in 5 minutes," said Banks. "At what a pace this fire goes," I replied. "We shall go faster." "If only Hood and his men were back," said Sir Edward. "The whistle! Sound the whistle!" cried Banks. "They may, perhaps, hear that." And darting into the turret, he made the airy sound with shrill screams, which were heard above the rumbling thunder, and must have sounded to an immense distance. The situation can be better imagined than described. Necessity urged to immediate flight, while it seemed impossible to forsake our absent friends. Banks returned to the hinder balcony. The edge of the fire was less than 50 yards from steam-house. The heat became insufferable. We could scarcely breathe the burning air. Flakes of fire fell on the carriages, which seemed protected in a measure by the floods and torrents of rain, but these, we well knew, could not check the direct attack of the flames. The engine continued to send forth piercing shrieks. It was all in vain. There were no signs of either Hood, Fox, or Guomi. The engine driver came to Banks. "Steam is up, sir," said he. "Go on then, Storr," replied Banks, "but not too fast. Just quick enough to keep us beyond the reach of the fire." "Stop, Banks. Wait a few minutes," cried Colonel Munro, who could not bring himself to quit the spot. 3 minutes then, Munro," returned Banks coolly, "but in 3 minutes the back of the train will begin to burn." 2 minutes passed. It was impossible to stay in the veranda. The iron plating could not be touched, and began to burst open at the joints. It would be madness to stop another instant. "Go on, Storr." "Hallo!" exclaimed the sergeant. "There they are! God be praised!" said the colonel. To the right of the road appeared Captain Hood and Fox, supporting Guomi in their arms as they approached the carriage door. "Is he dead?" "No, but struck by lightning, which smashed his gun, and has paralyzed his left leg." "We should never have got back to camp but for your steam whistle, Banks," said Hood. "Forward, forward!" shouted the engineer. Hood and Fox sprang on board the train, and Guomi, who had not lost consciousness, was placed in his cabin. It was 10:30. Banks and Storr went into the turret, and the equipage moved steadily forward, amid the blaze of a threefold light, produced by the burning forest, the electric lamps, and the vivid lightning flashes from the skies. Then Captain Hood, in a few words, related what had happened during his excursion. They had seen no traces of any wild animals. As the storm approached, Darkness overtook them much more rapidly than they expected. They were 3 miles from camp when they heard the first thunderclap, and endeavored to return, but quickly found they had lost their way among the banyan trunks, all exactly alike and without a path in any direction whatever. The tempest increased in violence. They were far beyond the limits of the light diffused by our electric lamp, and had nothing to guide them as to our whereabouts, while the rain and hail fell in torrents, quickly penetrating the shelter of the leafy screen above them. Suddenly, with a glare of immense brilliant lightning, a burst of thunder broke over them, and Guomi fell prostrate at Captain Hood's feet. The butt end of his gun alone remained in his hand, for it was instantaneously stripped of every bit of metal. They believed him to be killed, but found that the electric fluid had not struck him directly, although his leg was paralyzed by the shock. Poor Guomi could not walk a step, and had to be carried. His companions would not listen to his entreaties that they would leave him, escape themselves, and if possible return afterwards to fetch him. They raised him between them, and as best they could, pursued their doubtful way through the dark forest. Thus for 2 hours they wandered about, hesitating, stopping, resuming their march, without the slightest clue to the direction in which to find the camp. At last, to their infinite joy, they heard the shriek of the steam whistle. It was the welcome voice of Behemoth. A quarter of an hour later they arrived, as we were on the point of quitting the halting place, and only just in time. And now, though the rain ran rapidly along the broad, smooth forest road, the fire kept pace with it, and the danger was rendered the more threatening by a change of wind, such as frequently occurs during these violent meteoric storms. Instead of blowing in flank, it now changed to the rear, and by its vehemence materially increased the advance of the flames, which perceptibly gained on the travellers. A cloud of hot ashes whirled upwards from the ground, as from the mouth of some crater, and into this rained downwards burning branches and flakes of fire. The conflagration really resembled more than anything else the advance of a stream of lava, rushing across the country and destroying everything in its course. Banks instantly perceived this, and even if he had not, he would have felt the scorching blast as it swept by. Our speed was increased, although some danger attended in doing so over an unknown path. The machine, however, would not proceed as fast as the engineer could have wished, owing to the road being so cut up and flooded by rain. About 11:30, another awful clap of thunder burst directly over our heads. A cry escaped us. We feared that Banks and Storr had both been struck in their howdah, from which they were guiding the train. This calamity, however, had not befallen us. Our elephant only had been struck, the tip of one of his long hanging ears having attracted the electric current. No damage resulted to the machine, fortunately, and Behemoth seemed to try to reply to the peals of thunder by renewed and vigorous trumpetings. "Hurrah!" cried Captain Wood. "Hurrah! An elephant of flesh and blood would have been done for by this time, but this old fellow braves thunder and lightning and sticks at nothing. Go to, Behemoth! Hurrah!" For another half-hour the train was still ahead. Banks, fearing to run it against some obstacle, only proceeded at a rate sufficient to keep us out of reach of the fire. From the veranda, in which Colonel Munro, Hood, and I had placed ourselves, we could see passing great shadows, bounding through the blaze of the fire and lightning. We soon discovered them to be those of wild animals. As a precautionary measure, Captain Hood kept his gun ready, for it was possible that some terrified beast might leap on our train, in search of a shelter or refuge. One huge tiger did indeed make the attempt, but in his prodigious spring he was caught by the neck between 2 branches of a banyan tree, which, bending under the storm, acted like great cords and strangled the animal. "Poor beast," said Fox. "These creatures," remarked Captain Hood, in an indignant manner, "are made to be killed by good honest shot. You may well say poor beast." Poor Captain Hood was indeed out of luck. When he wanted tigers he couldn't find them, and now when he was not looking for them they passed within range, without his being able to get a shot at them, or were strangled before his eyes like mice in a trap. At 1 a.m, our situation, dangerous as it had been before, became worse. The wind, which shifted about from one point of the compass to another, continually swept the fire across the road in front of us, so that now we were absolutely hemmed in. The storm, however, had much diminished in violence, as is invariably the case when these meteors pass above a forest, for there the trees gradually draw off and absorb the electric matter. But though the lightning and thunder were now less frequent, and though the rain fell with gentler force, yet the wind still roared with inconceivable fury. At any cost it was absolutely necessary to hasten on, even at the risk of running into an obstacle, or of dashing over a precipice. Banks directed our course with astonishing coolness, his eyes glued to the glass of the howdah, his hand ever on the regulator. Our way now led between two hedges of fire, and these we were forced to go through. On went Banks, resolutely and steadily at the rate of 5 or 6 miles an hour. I thought at last we should be obliged to stop when before us lay a narrow passage, only 50 yards wide, with a roaring furnace on either side. Our wheels crunched over the glowing cinders which strewed the soil, and a burning, stifling atmosphere enveloped us. We were past. At 2 a.m, a flash of lightning revealed to us the borders of the wood. Behind us lay a vast panorama of flames, which would spread on and never stop until they had devoured the very last banyan of the immense forest. At daybreak we halted at last. The storm had entirely ceased, and we arranged our camp. Our elephant, who was carefully examined, was found to have the tip of his right ear pierced by several holes running in diverse directions. If such a thing had happened to any other creature than an animal of steel, it would most certainly have at once sunk down, never again to rise, and our unfortunate train would then have been rapidly overwhelmed by the advancing flames. At 6 a.m, after a very short rest, we again resumed our journey, and by 12 o'clock we were encamped in the neighborhood of Rewa. End of chapter 12.